Hello. It's great to see you all here this evening, or morning, depending on where you're logging in from. Tonight, we will explore together trauma and its impact on learning. The trauma of natural disaster, the trauma of the global pandemic, the trauma of racism. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge those around the world that are living in conflict and fear of war, famine, oppression, illness. All our fellow educators and their students in Israel, Palestine, Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Haiti, and the Ukraine. And now, I will welcome to the stage Dr. Sal Taurasi, the director of the Lesley Institute for Trauma Sensitivity, to begin our program.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm Sal Taurasi, director of LIfTS. Please let me extend my greetings to all of our guests and participants, both north and south of the equator. Our focus in this convening will be to look at trauma through a cultural lens. Of course, we all share a common interest in the well-being of children, but our experience in developing trauma-sensitive schools has taught us how important it is to understand local context. Toward that end, we have invited several participants from various parts of the globe, and it is now my distinct honor to introduce them. Beginning with Julie Avery from Australia, and most recently New Zealand, and with her Ben Sacco.
Hi, everybody.
Kia ora koutou. It's fabulous to be here. Such a great convening to get underway.
Yeah, it's really exciting to be a part of this movement and the conversation that's global around how to support those that really benefit from these conversations the most.
I was having a few technical issues just then. I was getting multiple voices. I'm sure it's not my head. So maybe just a brief introduction, Ben, of how you're involved and what you do.
Yeah, that'd be great. So I work in Australia. I work for the MacKillop Institute, which is part of the MacKillop Family Services. And their work is to support some of the most vulnerable young people, families. They do an incredible job around their expertise in trauma, complex trauma, and supporting the needs of those on the ground that need it the most. And my role specifically is in the education portfolio of working with a particular model called Reframing Learning and Teaching Environments. And the goal of this model is to work with schools in Australia, and that's cross-sector, and to actually help support teachers to build capability, to understand adverse childhood experiences, the way in which that can change the body and the brain of our young developing children, and the lasting impacts into adulthood. And what's incredible around being a part of some of this work is that we are able to involve our systems, our education systems and the personnel to actually work with the schools that they support at a system level and create a collective movement around addressing and responding to some of the important needs of our young people. My background is education and also in the professional development space for capability development and adult learning. Julie.
Great, lovely. And I'm, yes, I am zooming in from New Zealand, and I'm an educational and developmental psychologist. I've worked across a range of services, but many years in our Ministry of Education in New Zealand before moving to Australia and experiencing the system there. Also working with disadvantaged young people and their families across the complexities of all our siloed systems in mental health and youth justice, and residential care or out-of-home care. I'm at the moment working for Monash University in Australia and researching trauma-responsive schools.
And it might be worth making that connection for our awesome audience that Julie and I, our paths cross because of the work that Monash and Julie is supporting the evaluation of some of our work on the ground with our schools. So we've been fortunate to work together and measure our impact and measure the change that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's such good work too.
Hello, Sal.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. Next, my pleasure to present, also for a 5-minute intro, Camila Russ from Chile.
Thank you, Sal. So hello, everyone in this session. My name is Camila Russ. I'm a Chilean educator. I work for the largest and oldest school network in Chile named CIP Red de Colegios. Also, an active member of Chile Más Teachers Program. Chile Más is a non-profit organization that works on building bridges of innovation and knowledge between Chile and the state of Massachusetts. So I've been working with them. And recently, I'm an international fellow at Lesley Institute for Trauma Sensitivity. So I've been doing some research on social emotional learning in the Chilean context. I carry a 8-year teaching experience, 4 years mentoring novice teachers and doing research lately. So I hope you enjoy my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. Now, please welcome Veronica Tobar with a perspective from Ecuador and also Washington, D.C., right here in the States.
Thank you, Sal. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Veronica Tobar. I am, and that's not mine. Give me 1 second. There you go. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Anyway, so I'm an Ecuadorian educator with more than 20 years of experience between Quito, Ecuador, and Washington, D.C. in the United States. We'll be talking about the compared experiences between these two places. Okay, although we do not have an access test study in Ecuador, however, I wanted to share some of the numbers that reflect those adverse childhood experiences. Some numbers that reflect those, some numbers that really stood to me that come from the Pan American Health Organization report in 2010 is that 21% of children under 18 have suffered sexual abuse. A study from UNICEF in 2016 shows that 40% of children receive violent treatment by their parents and 26% by their teachers. We know that some of these children are suffering violent treatment from both. 60% have witnessed violence between students. Another scary number is that teenage pregnancy. So many little and young girls carrying babies with no legal abortion in case of sexual abuse. Here are the results of ACEs in Washington, D.C. in comparison with the national average. D.C. scores higher than the U.S. average in almost every category. Only mental illness and divorce, D.C. scores below the average. We also know that there are some connections between discrimination and domestic and neighborhood violence and the time in jail subcomponents. Now, what have we done? So Ecuador has the right framework. We get it. We know what needs to be done, right? We have created a graduate profile of SEL. The students are learning about life skills from preschool to high school on 5 domains: self-awareness, managing emotions, empathy, problem solving, and making decisions. By law, a school cannot operate without a student counselor department. We have strong laws that protect children and adolescents. We have created curriculum guides on values education, sexual violence, drug abuse, and bullying prevention. We have wonderful initiatives like restorative practices and dialogic learning. However, only 2% of public schools teachers have trained in these initiatives. While private schools cannot operate without a DESE, only 3% of public schools have one, which deepens the disparity in our society. I wanted to use this chart from Building Strong Brains of Tennessee of Culture Change that will help me explain the Ecuadorian situation. So we're doing a good job with the green and part of the orange circles. But when it comes to funding, everything crumbles and things won't land in the classroom unless we follow through. But what about these seeds? So they have the Project Aware, Advancing Wellness and Resilience in Education for all public schools and 2 public charter schools. They use a trauma-responsive school model that includes family and community partnerships, safe and supportive environment, early intervention, healing-centered treatment, and educational practices. The 3 R's: relationships, routines, and resilience, and the 5 non-negotiables. Where kids have the opportunity to be greeted with a positive and affirmative language, the community has behavior expectations, they practice emotional regulation, build trusting relationships, and teachers are also being taken care of. But we know that when most public high schools are rated under 4, that this doesn't look the same for all our school population. Now, I know this is very disheartening. However, we need to be that one person that helps the students compartmentalize their lives so they know there is a brighter future. According to the National Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children, resilience research shows that those who do better than others exposed to the same traumatic experiences have at least one significant person they are securely attached to: a parent, a caregiver, or any caring adult. So let's be that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronica. And now from Louisiana, we'll hear a few words from John Newman and Alyshia Boagni.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Alyshia Boagni. I am a former school counselor from the state of Louisiana. I've grown up here my whole life. My whole family is from here, mine and my husband's. And incidentally, my father-in-law is a city court judge. So the reality of childhood adversity was near and dear to my heart, and it drew me into the counseling profession. I'm currently a licensed professional counselor. And so having that mental health awareness and going into the public school system here in Louisiana, it brought about just an awareness for a sense of just advocacy for the needs that, quite similar to what Veronica so eloquently illustrated, is the same in many parts of the world. I appreciated so much her beautiful illustrations. I don't have as much. I do have some slides to show the state of ACEs in Louisiana, particularly, our focus on children. What we focused on in the state of Louisiana, this was a study begun by our state ACEs initiative, which has been a largely centralized effort from, just our Department of Health and from the First Lady's office. Those are and a lot of statewide universities have spearheaded gathering this data. But so I've not personally been a part of it, but but it just reflects just where we are in the country. 12% of our children have a parent who was ever incarcerated. You can see here, 26% of Louisiana children live in households below the poverty line. Poverty due to years of, just systemic racism, for lack of a better word, has resulted in our high, rates of poverty and the educational disparity that we see among our poorer children and children of color. So continuing to try to push academic rigor in a low-performing school with this knowledge of how trauma impacts learning and how our children who have high ACEs developmentally, they're socially and emotionally, years behind their peers who have greater advantages, left me with no other choice but to pursue this work further. So currently I am nearly a full-time volunteer ACE educator. And that is how John Newman and I came to our paths crossed. I was reaching out for resources. Speaking of underfunded, we are just in our state, our ACE educator program is largely centralized under the Department of Health. And it is how we are spreading the language of trauma, what trauma is. And so we see that our greatest impact is going to be systemic as we just try to raise awareness for what ACEs are. And along the way, partnering and supporting, local schools in the work that they're doing as the schools are struggling to become trauma informed. So, I'll hand it over to John and let him explain his vision.
Thank you, Alyshia. I'm John Newman. I'm very honored to be here this evening. I'm the CEO of a faith-based non-for-profit here in Lafayette. It's called New Hope. Prior to that, I've been in pastoral ministry for about 20 years. And so working with under-resourced kids, that was a very new thing to me. And it was within the first year or so of working with those children that we discovered what ACEs were. And we saw huge academic gaps. We saw behavioral issues, and we tried to figure out what those things were. And as we researched it, we came across child trauma. And my family, we'd been in middle-class churches, middle-class neighborhoods our whole life. Working in this neighborhood was an eye-opening experience for us. So when we saw that, my wife and I decided that not only would we work in our neighborhood, but we also needed to advocate for some systemic change in our community. So with Alyshia and several others, we have a task force, an ACEs task force here in Lafayette. We're getting ACE educators out in the community, trying to educate the public. So I'm part of that. I'm also part of another organization that's trying to narrow the achievement gap in our city and looking at some of the structural issues that cause that achievement gap. And there's about 18 organizations that are a part of that. So we're trying to hit some of the levers that can move some of the structural issues. And the last thing is because of my faith-based background, I've become convinced that one of the big issues is that people within my own tradition, conservative Protestantism, both black and white, see the world very, very differently and are very divided. And so a big effort, I'm extending a big effort in trying to bring two very disparate people groups together, black and white churches, trying to create some dialogue and understanding, because I think the people in the congregation of the churches that I've been at my whole life don't understand what it's like to live in a poor household, in a poor neighborhood, and how traumatic that is. And when your eyes are open to that, then you become convinced something needs to be done. So we want to, one of our goals here in Lafayette is to connect those two communities so they can hear those stories, engage their hearts, and changed some belief systems.
Thank you, John and Alyshia. In the next segment of our program, we'd like to engage all of our participants from the various countries in discussion around 3 central questions. And that discussion will be moderated by our lead clinical faculty person at LIfTS. My pleasure to introduce Joe Restuccia to lead that discussion.
Thank you, Sal. My name is Joe Restuccia, and I am the lead clinical faculty at the Lesley Institute for Trauma Sensitivity. And I'm honored and delighted to be here this evening to moderate a conversation among our participants. And you can see they're all joining us now on the screen. And I'm going to try and structure this, discussion with a couple of questions and encourage participants as you have a thought or an idea. The purpose here is to have a discussion and a dialogue. So I'm going to start off with Ben and Julie from Australia and New Zealand with the question of, what are the beliefs and understandings your schools hold about trauma and traumatic experience and its impacts on learning behavior and social emotional wellness?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in with the beginning of the conversation, straight out of the box here. Talking about what we're seeing versus what we think, right? So what we're seeing on the ground with our schools is that there is a disparity between the terminology of trauma and the stereotypes that come with that, and the definitions around what is a young person who has had a complex trauma in their life versus, as some people on this screen have talked about, ACEs and even some of the challenges around adverse childhood experiences and grief and loss, and so they may not have experienced complex trauma, but they're experiencing challenging times when mum and dad are divorcing, or there's a loss of a loved one that was sudden, and that can have a real impact on that child's development if the right supports aren't in place to help them through that. So we're seeing in our schools this understanding that they start with around their definitions of trauma, of adverse childhood experiences, and their desire to want to connect this to improve and enhance teaching and learning. And the ways in which, as they learn about these concepts, the ways in which their teaching and learning environments are actually becoming safe and predictable and consistent environments for these young people. I can start with that and pass to Julie.
Thank you, Ben. Such an interesting question. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's fair to say trauma isn't understood in the same way between our Indigenous people and Western definitions. And it's not a term that is widely used here in education. You would hear it in mental health and addiction services, certainly, but in education, not so much. A lot of work is done around social emotional learning, and connections are now being made between adverse experiences and what people are seeing in behaviours and needs and learning impacts. However, it's really contextualised within a Māori worldview. Trauma is seen as a call out around colonialism and a settler nation and the enduring injustices that have been experienced. That is where our First Nations and potentially Pacifica people, probably less so, would go with that thinking. And those are the very issues that are really pertinent to achieve change in New Zealand. And we'll speak more to that later on. But I think really there is a great deal of work to do for a shared understanding of trauma and then what to do around that.
Mm-hmm. This is the conversation flow that is really exciting, because that's a really important one about that shared language and that that shared understanding of some of the terminology and the way in which it can be displaced in conversations. So really, I just wanted to shout out to Julie. Really great. We talk in education in a lot of parts of the world about purpose and shared understanding and consistency in practice. But we also see in our Australian schools that people are working really hard to try and achieve that. There are external factors that can create stress in our schools that put our educators in a position of surviving and attempting to thrive in their role, but dealing with the impacts of their own adversities and needing to create structures that allow them to regulate through the school day while they're trying to help support these young people. And obviously we could talk more in the session, but I thought that was a great example of a conversation that could go off somewhere. Joe?
Yeah, no, great point. And I want to get a sense from the others here as well. Camila, could you talk to us some about the understanding and beliefs, held in the schools in Chile around trauma and its impacts on learning behavior and social emotional wellness?
Sure. Yes. I would like to start saying that everything I'm about to say is the beautiful result of wonderful pedagogical conversation I've had with some fellow teachers from Chile Math Teachers program. So we are a huge group of educators, Chilean educators, all of us teaching vulnerable contexts. And as a Chilean educator teaching in vulnerable contexts, I find it relevant to start with the concept of vulnerability, because vulnerability is a dominating trait in the Latin American region due to the bad distribution of resources through our whole history. And also because if we do a historical journey, vulnerability now is not the same as it used to be years ago. So 20 years ago, vulnerability in our case was related to poverty mainly when we talked about educational context. But nowadays, I can see vulnerability is pretty much related to the children as a person with rights and the people and institutions in charge of providing that child well-being. And yeah, so when I think of our students' vulnerability, I start thinking of a lack of parental support. We can see that parents are not available for our students, maybe physically because they need to work, but many times is emotionally unavailable. Maybe because they are not healthy enough, but also because they lack parenting skills. So students spend a lot of lonely time, and all these adverse traumatic situations happen in that time and space. I also find relevant to mention that culturally speaking, in Chile there is a lack of consciousness of the child as a person with rights in the society, which makes the whole experience of being a child very, very traumatic. Why? Because in terms of emotional connections, there is a lack of protection from adult caregivers and those institutions, for example, the state, that should ensure the well-being of a child. So this generates a learned feeling of hopelessness and despair that triggers mistrust, fear, and anger. So that's what they bring to school every day. That's the set of emotions that we Chilean educators face every day. I don't know if you agree.
Well, I don't think it's about agreeing, Camila. I think it's about the reality in Chile and in the schools. And
yeah,
thank you. I think that's pretty clear and such a dynamic contrast to some of what we heard so far. So let me move to Veronica. Veronica, share with us the understandings and beliefs.
Thank you, Joe. As I'm listening, everyone, I feel that there are so many things that are connected, and one thing that comes to my mind is systemic racism, and I feel this knowledge, at least in Ecuador and here in DC as well, what needs to be done, right? But at the end, it's not happening, right? Like we know about SEL, and it's not really getting to the classrooms, right? Our students learning, we know that our students learning will be negatively impacted if they are thinking about what happened that morning, or if they are scared about what could happen in the afternoon. And we're going to see behaviors in our classrooms, and many are unacceptable, that are authentic cries for help. And I'm sure that all teachers that have had that experience, where they dealt with a student or an adult, right, in an unempathetic way, and to later learn that they were going through a very traumatic experience. And I think we can learn from this, right? Interactions with the students and people in general need to be done through the lens of trauma, and because trauma is silent, yet very loud. And it is silent because people do not carry a label or a flag that says handle with care. But the interactions do say something different, and they are difficult to deal with. And especially when those behaviors are triggers for the adults in charge, it is a vicious cycle. I think that it only gets broken with intentional steps. And, those steps that treats every student and every colleague with care.
Yeah.
And so, thank you, Joe.
Very clear. So let me just, can I put you on the spot here, Ben? Because when you described the beliefs and understandings in Australia, there is this, you talked about an understanding at a level that they not only are they approaching and addressing the needs of students, but they're using their understanding of trauma and its impacts as a guidepost in terms of what works for all kids. If I heard you correct, did I hear that correctly? And so my question is, what allowed the educators in Australia to begin to see this as the issue that it is? Because what I'm hearing from others is that there are impediments, there are things in the way. Can you provide any insight from your experience in Australia? Like, why is that just front and, it doesn't sound like you're having that struggle.
No, it's probably fair to say that there are always those struggles that exist as well. We are talking about complexities around changing behaviours and shifting mindsets and deepening people's knowledge in areas that we heard John, you talked about earlier in the intros around coming in your work across the ACEs, and that took you down the path of learning more about the trauma and the connections. That's the journey that we're seeing our educators and our systems go down. We've got amazing academics in parts of Australia doing real pushes around a national framework for trauma-informed schooling. There's movements happening. But remember that, and I can't speak for global colleagues here, but from an education point of view, for a long time we've positioned our systems to be very much about the academic achievement, right? And learning the literacy, numeracy, the skills that allow our young people to go into a workforce and do some great things in a workforce. But there are a lot of people where that didn't work, right? We have conversations around the system's not fit for some of these people, and we say these people don't fit the system. I would argue that actually we have to be agile enough and responsive to the needs of the individuals, which is why when we talk educationally around differentiated learning and individualized learning, it's more than just a piece of paper that sets out a plan, would be the argument we would have. We've got to look at the individual's point of learning need and take into account their history where we can. But we talk about with our educators, schools are an integral part of the support team, but they're not the only team, right? So our educators are just understanding that it's not all on them to understand neuroscience and psychology and, recovery from recovery processes from pandemics, and in Australia we're currently dealing with floods, and some 2,000 people misplaced, not in homes right now in New South Wales, in some of our really hard hit areas. So they're dealing with on the ground experiences of adversity, and for some trauma that we're working through prior challenges. So just to sort of make clear that what we're really seeing is a shift in behaviours and attitudes through the work of working alongside our educators. And I think the key thing is we're not asking educators to change the way they do what they do. We respect what they do. We're just asking them to reframe the position sometimes. And understand the surface level behaviour is one thing, but what's actually the underlying cause and the function for the young person when they respond to behaviours of concern.
So really asking them to understand and adopt that lens that one gets when one understands trauma and its impacts. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
no, it's a good one. But let's to have the sake of the conversation, to the friends here on the screen and the audience, right? How do you help someone see something they've never experienced, right? Mm-hmm. How do you influence someone to think about the perspective of another person when you've never walked in the shoes of that person? So one of my colleagues there said vulnerability. We're helping people understand the power of vulnerability, and that it's a courageous to be vulnerable, as Brené Brown talks about. It's a understanding of what it means to be open and have these conversations around mental health and physical health. And I think that's why we're seeing some shifts. We have a long way to go, but if I'm fair to Julie was a part of some early pilot work with MacKillop. We're down the track of, I think, 4 to 7 years of piloting things with schools. So you can imagine the change over that period of time as well. Yep. Yeah.
Ben, thanks. So John and Alyshia, could you share with us, the beliefs and understandings in Louisiana?
Well,
its impacts that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I don't know if we could speak for all of Louisiana, but for what we see in Lafayette, I would say 8 or 10 years ago, nobody was really talking about ACEs or child trauma. In the educational system, as students got their degrees in education, they weren't really being taught about ACEs. It wasn't part of professional development. It just wasn't happening. But there have been some greater forces at work. A lot of not just the advocacy that Alyshia and I are doing, but there's a lot of other things that are happening in our community and in our state that have gotten the conversation going. And I would say that there are a lot more educators aware of ACEs and trauma than there were 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. But it hasn't, we're in the early understanding. And so our policies and our procedures haven't caught up with our understandings. So that's part of where we are, I think.
Yeah. Alyshia, you're muted. I'm sorry.
So sorry about that.
No worries.
The advocacy work that John is referring to is when I stepped into the position as a school counselor, it was largely perceived as a bureaucratic position, an administrative position. And as with a mental health background, I knew about adverse childhood experiences, and that was just a personal passion of mine to work with families who couldn't have access to mental health services. And what I assumed that was, it was at that time, it was probably 2018. It was 4 years ago now. I just went around and asked every single person in the school that I was in, from administrators to janitors, if they'd ever heard of childhood adversity.
Right. And
from then went straight to my school superintendent and the director of curriculum and said, have you seen Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative? I was basically speaking Greek at the time. ACEs was still a card game, in most people's perception. When you said ACEs, it was a very foreign concept. But what I was extremely fortunate to see at that time, we went from very little understanding of childhood trauma. Trauma in general was perceived as something that happened in a car accident. It was extremely isolated. And in the time that we just began, I was allowed to start a mental health, a trauma task force, and I was allowed very graciously to become an adverse childhood experiences educator and train our entire school district. In a southern state like ours, I considered that a very favorable hand. Yes, our ACEs are high, our childhood, and our understanding of ACEs and childhood adversity and how trauma affects learning still has a ways to go. But I would say in the 4 years, I've seen a significant understanding and awareness in the belief system of our administrators. Those were the hands, those were the voices that I wanted to hear from. I knew that the teachers, particularly the teachers in our poorest schools, they knew what ACEs were. They knew what childhood trauma was and how it affected learning. They didn't need to hear a PowerPoint from me. But it was the administrators who were removed from the classroom, who were removed from, those day-to-day, bringing uniforms and, wiping away tears, that needed to be reminded of how what their belief system was impacting their test scores and ultimately their school performance scores. And, I was saying some very political and potentially controversial things, but, I do have to extend just my extreme gratitude to the state, just our state superintendent met with me, which is just shows, I think, his openness, his willingness to understand and to listen and begin a dialogue. We do have a long way to go. Our ACE educator program for the state is working with our Department of Education. That's something our legislature passed to try to inform belief systems, just to introduce how trauma impacts learning and say that there are resources that are available. But, I had texted in the private chat to Julie and Ben just to find out how long was the work in the community around just increasing awareness of what childhood trauma is. How long was that saturating the community before the schools were asked to come alongside? And don't let me not misquote, but, it seems like it was a good 10 to 15 years of community saturation before the schools were asked to begin to shift their mindset. So John and I are playing a long game. We're shooting for just increasing that language so that we can allow our educators to hear this information and start to absorb it in their own contexts, in their own communities. Yep. But they are receptive, is what I would say.
Thank you, Alyshia. You make the point, I think, about, playing the long game rather than the short game. And I think, Veronica, in some of your comments, you mentioned how that, when you talk about systemic racism, I would also talk about the shift that people seem to be articulating as a shift in the systemic nature of the schools and how they operate. So if I were to ask each of you, what are the priority urgencies you feel right now in your schools, right, in the areas where you work, around, traumatic experience and beginning to address the impacts of trauma on student learning? How would you articulate the urgencies, those urgencies? They could go on forever, but those priority urgencies that you all are feeling, right? And I think I'm going to start with Veronica.
Thank you, Joe. Well, I think I need to separate my experience, the urgencies that I feel. I worked, as in my actual work, and those of Ecuador and DC in general. And I work in a public charter school that it's awesome, and we have a very diverse population, both in among teachers and the staff, and of course students, and that already creates a space that it's safe, right, or safer for all of us. But I want to talk about DC and Ecuador because I think it's where I see the most urgencies, right? And I do think that those those, I'm very political. I feel that I'm very political, but those in power need to take it seriously, right? I see an urgency in breaking the cycle of institutional racism and discrimination. I think that all students are and their families need to be valued, feel safe, be represented, and have access to equitable opportunities. I believe that schools need to be aware of their hidden curriculum. And teachers need to understand their power, the power of one. As teachers, we have a huge responsibility dealing with our own trauma and triggers. And this needs to be, undertaken as a journey. It is a hard, but also a joyful and beautiful process that will never end. And I think we need to be aware of our biases and intentionally work on them. We're part of our society that is constantly bombarding us with biased models, and we definitely need to be vigilant to make sure that those seeds are not sprouting, right? We also we all get. I feel that when we get into this profession, we start getting serious about this journey. And for me, coming, I have to say, I recognize coming from a privileged environment with zero ACEs. My real journey, and this goes a little bit with what you were saying, Ben, before, like them being empathetic, right? How do you connect if you're not going through, or if you've never gone through that? And I have to say that to me, my real journey started with my first strong traumatic experience. I've had experience, traumatic experiences. I'm a woman, and because of that, I've been, discriminated, and still are. And living in a foreign country, I am discriminated in many ways. But the biggest experience, right, was when my son died. I had never gone to therapy before. And I started a group therapy with a wonderful group of people. And I studied for 2 years around alternative ways of healing, and more specifically about emotional decoding of illnesses. And the truth is that those interconnected experiences literally rewired my brain and the way I live my life, and of course, the way I teach.
Well, thank you, Veronica, for sharing that deeply personal motivation. And I think hear you very clearly. It's, when does the leadership of schools at a very high level, or the country, the culture, take this seriously? It's one thing to talk the talk, but when are they going to actually walk the walk? Yeah, thank you. Julie, what when you think about New Zealand and some of the things you've described, like how would you articulate your, priority urgencies?
There's a lot of overlap with what Veronica was sharing in many ways, and also thank you for sharing your personal journey of loss, and that has made me think back to how we frame education and our roles as educators, whatever they may be in the school system. And I believe there is a shift happening in New Zealand that had its roots many years, maybe 20 years ago, when we were, as educators, confronted, if you like, with the treaty that was made with our Indigenous people and never honoured, never fully honoured, and in many ways never honoured at all. And that is the primary issue in New Zealand when you think of cycles of disadvantage. There is racism. There are the enormous opportunity gaps in health, in employment, education levels, in our prison systems, so in accessing services that may help, in having well-resourced Indigenous programs, even though we have had these programs for a very long time. And it is nothing new now. We're talking, because I'm getting a bit old, we're talking about the third generation of educators coming through who are trained, like treaty training is something we all have. It's not a one-stop shop. It is revisited all the time. And as Veronica was saying, this is a life journey. This is not thinking that let's learn about this thing and apply it in some way and change our policies and practice. This is a complete reset of how we think about ourselves in relation to each other, and whatever that other is, that we find ways to connect, to build identity, and to see the positives in difference and the positives in even the conflicts, if you like. That's just probably a far too strong term, but in discussions where you feel like you need to just be quiet or you're going to cause a riot, that we embrace those more. And as a very English colonized nation, we tend to steer clear of those sorts of conversations. And I feel the urgencies for us now is to really reset the thinking that I'm a teacher, you're a student, you're learners together. And that is very much part of our Māori pedagogy, that the teacher learns as much from the student as the student learns from teachers, and that the ancestors are present in the room because the student is present in the room. They bring their ancestors with them. And this thing about land that we've taken over pretty much in New Zealand is a fundamental identity point. You can't teach around anything in the world, history, sociology, science, and remove culture from that and cultural knowledge. So it's positioning ourselves to value other ways of knowing, valuing other knowledges, and embracing those and learning from each other. And you probably realize I never said trauma or ACEs in there, and I think that is just reflecting how New Zealand talks about these things. We talk about it differently, and I would have to explain myself if I went into any given school what ACEs were. You just don't hear that here. But if you start talking about cycles of disadvantage, of the poverty, of the racism, of the impact of being colonized, people will understand that.
Yep. And so as you talk, it strikes me that you and Veronica, there's so much overlap in terms of there is this need to shift, if you will, those underlying assumptions that we've been operating under for so long, and that is really a reset individually and personally, as well as a reset culturally and in our large community. Yeah, thank you, Camila. When you think of urgencies in your schools, it's been a pretty heady discussion so far, but where do you come out?
Yeah, I want to be as brief as possible. So I would say, first of all, as a society, we need to recognize a child as a person with rights. From there is a visibility and appreciation and respect towards their processes and individualities. And in that sense, we shouldn't forget that we are teachers. So we are agents in this society who should ensure those kids' well-being. And then as a Chilean educator, I would say, and I'm going to take Ben's words, we need to change or shift teachers' mindset. We need to stop focusing on students' academic performance, and we need to start focusing our efforts on students' emotional well-being, which is super difficult in Chile because school budget depends on students' academic performance. So poor academic performance derives on no money next year for school. However, I'm pretty sure that we need to train ourselves around trauma and learning in order to provide our students a learning environment which is safe, supportive, and welcoming. And finally, as members of a community, I would say the dissemination of knowledge is fundamental. We need to inform the community on what we've been learning. And when I say community, I mean parents, teachers, and administrators.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you, Camila. That, again, getting at very specific assumptions that underlie a lot of what happens in Chile, that child as a person worthy of respect and, with rights and privileges, right? So, John, Alyshia, talk to us about the urgencies in Lafayette, Louisiana for your schools.
Well, I think one of the urgencies is there's a saying that the most dangerous person is the person who thinks they know. And we have a lot of issues in some of our schools here in Lafayette. And before I started working with the children that I work with now, I thought I knew. And a lot of what needs to happen is actually unlearning. And our public schools are a reflection of our community. And the issues in our public schools are really reflections of our breakdown in our society. So now, how do we help our community? And when I'm talking about community, I'm talking about a grander vision, the whole city. How do we get everybody to understand? Mm-hmm. I don't think we can do that intellectually, because I think everybody has little compartments. They have their existing belief system, they have their existing paradigm, and if you give them information, they're going to put that information in a little box. So if I talk to them about what I'm thinking in terms of social emotional learning, they're going to put me in a category. All right. So how do you help somebody understand when they think they already know and they already have established categories? The only way you do that is through story, and you have to introduce people to each other. You have to bring the two disparate communities in Lafayette together. They have to become friends. And I don't think it's going to happen through argumentation. We have to find ways to actually bring people who are far apart together to actually care about one another. So to me, that is the urgency.
Yep. Thank you, John. So,
Alyshia?
Ben? Oh, I'm sorry, Alyshia.
Yeah, so many great perspectives have been shared already. I agree with so much of just what John said. So I kind of just, you have that thing that's clouding your mind. You just have to get it out. So last night I had just a remarkable privilege. Our community came together and hosted a community summit on education, in which our 13 regional school superintendents participated in a panel. Not all 13. We had half of them probably. And so they and some of our teacher leaders who were nominated and awarded were given a chance to answer this very question. So it was interesting to hear what I heard as their perceptions. And of course, from our administrators, it was a lot of what we're hearing. I think Veronica said it's a lot of legislation and funding are tying their hands in terms of policies. I think at the outset of this conversation with teachers and administrators at both district and local school, individual school levels, everybody agreed that discipline policies were historically, systemically brutal and creating a racial pipeline to prison, which just disenfranchised so many people, parents and their children, from the education system as a whole. And so initially I thought I would have said discipline policies, being able to do away with policies that keep teachers and administrators from building living, breathing relationships with students that see that keep them from teaching the children with a whole with a whole child concept. And that was exactly what I found I was hearing from the teacher leaders. The teacher leaders described things like doing away with standardized testing and changing out just scripted curriculum. And but mainly, they were asking for substitute teachers right now because of the COVID. Because of COVID, we have so many teacher shortages as well as substitute teacher shortages, and so even our best teachers are feeling frayed. I think just emotionally frayed, and it is toward the end of our academic school year. But yes, what I heard was that they want more opportunities to just wonder with the children and return of just a beautiful way of learning, introducing a beautiful way, a natural way, like Dr. Montessori would have done, just allowing children to learn from kinesthetics and conversations, and not restricting them to time limits on subject matter and not restricting them to, to filling in the bubbles so that we can build relationships in the classroom. So I would add one other thing.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No,
one
go
other
ahead,
thing
please.
was, as the counselor in me wants to be able to reach our parents and ensure that the parents feel supported and welcome to come into our school systems. And I don't know if it's just the COVID pandemic right here still creating physical barriers, but parents do feel somewhat, I think, a disconnect from physically being able to go into the schools as they used to volunteer and interact and give a teacher a break, bring muffins or something. Those kind of natural relational things have been taken away. And so people want more of that.
Yep. Great points. Thank you, Alyshia, so much. I'm sorry I kept, I was misreading. I thought you were done. So I want to now come to you, Ben, and ask, how you would articulate the urgencies, the priority urgencies of the schools you're familiar with in Australia.
Firstly, I would be there if there's muffins and cupcakes, Alyshia. So that's the simple stuff that makes a difference. Really, in answer to this question in the most concise way, what I love about this is we are, apart from I know Julie, I don't know any of you, but yet here we are with our audience as well, talking about something because we connect to the purpose of what we're talking about, which is to enrich the lives of those around us that are either less fortunate from the minute they were born. They didn't ask for a particular life, they were born into it. And we have a culture sometimes where we hear people say, but everyone's got the same opportunities. Well, I'm lucky. I've got, as in this example, both arms and both legs. But I know a friend of mine who I met through school wasn't born with one arm. That's not the same opportunity. People experience struggle in their life, but they also can start their life, with a world that looks differently at them. Now, it's normal for him to experience his life, how he was born. But then you throw into the mix, which we see with our young people, the influence of TV, reality TV, the influence of technology and social media, the influence of the way in which parents were parented, and they mean well, but they're parenting based on the learnings that they had. In answer to your question, I wrote a few things which I think people have really brought home here. We hear from teachers in our schools, we don't have time. We don't, not time to do trauma-informed practice, as in we don't have time to do what we love. We feel that it's an overcrowded curriculum. We feel that there are meetings after meetings and there aren't necessarily actions that make our day better. When we started listening more because we wanted to be attuned to those needs of staff, of educators, what we realized very quickly is that they're not saying they don't want to do some of these things that we talk about, learn about ACEs and the changing body and the brains of young people. Right. What they're saying is they themselves are operating from a position of high stress, and they're not feeling like, to use terms like window of tolerance, right, in neuroscience, they're not feeling like they're able to operate in the creative, innovative space. And what's happening is we are losing good teachers. Yes. We have over 50% of our educators in Australia with a Bachelor of Education, a teaching degree of some sort, I should say, to correct that, are not in the profession at the moment. We know in the first 5 years, we're seeing a lot of graduates leave the profession
Yep.
I met with a few graduates 2 years out, and they said to me in some of our delivery last week, they said, I don't know if I want a career in teaching. It just seems like everything is everywhere, you know? And we've got to change. I think an urgency is to change the way in which we create our curriculum requirements, which is a big one and takes time. But why, with COVID over the last 2 years, would we ever expect a little grade 3, so a 7-year-old, for those that have different ways of talking about this, to understand the 2 years of learning when they had disrupted learning and remote learning?
Right.
They haven't mastered the curriculum. But now we're asking them to master curriculum that's 2 years ahead of where they actually were able to be learning. And so I think an urgency is to look at some of the way in which we expect curriculum to be rolled out in schools, and include things that don't hinder recovery for those that are experiencing trauma or adverse childhood experiences. But also advocate for our schools that say we need more time to do what we thought we were entering a profession to do: inspire kids, learn about our kids and what it means to be human. Isn't it sad when we have educators tell us they don't feel they have the time to get to know kids because they've got to get through the tests? You know, yep. I think a big one, just for the sake of landing it, because I love that we've had some passionate landings of really big concepts, get us around the room around the funding models. I would love to see personally, I'm not in the role to see it, but I'd love to see at federal level how we fund these things. And in what world are we really going to live in where we continually disadvantage our most needed communities based on a funding model? You know, you don't meet the need on census day, therefore we're not going to give a school certain money. I think there's really systemic issues and political issues that need to be addressed. But on the ground, an only other urgency that we're seeing in our schools is 0 to 8-year-olds. How we can get in early and start supporting the knowledge around this for, if not intervention at that age, it's about prevention. So when a 5-year-old who's experiencing a learning environment with their teachers has an experience of trauma 5 years later, they've actually been exposed to the safe, predictable environments and the way in which we can talk about this for recovery when it lands in their life. But I come back to the muffin, Alyshia. If we can have muffins, and I think there's probably many audience members thinking our parent engagement is huge. We've all been hit really hard with COVID and the impacts, which has probably accelerated some of the urgency around what it means to be human and getting together. And just, you know, despite a few things happening across our globally right now, which we all understand, just get back in the ring together and be friends. You know, the ring of love, not the fighting ring. You know, the circle of working together for a common cause. You know, enough's enough, we almost have to say.
Yep. Thank you, Ben. And I want to join that bandwagon on the muffins, whether they're blueberry or otherwise. You know, I think
white chocolate, Joe. White chocolate.
There we go. There we go. I'm in. And even though we're over time, I have to ask this last question, which is, so much of what we've talked about, you know, there's a lot of big picture ideas, and I love that about this conversation. I was wondering, in a very short period of time, or very briefly, if you could think in terms of, you know, we have these needs to shift, whether, you know, it is the curriculum or it is mindsets. What are things we can do locally, right, within our span of influence, that would begin to move the needle, that would be aligned with all these urgencies we've been talking about? What are some of, you know, things we can do? It's you know, there's policy and politics and all that, and I'm not saying that's not important. I'm thinking to myself, you know, there's always that balance between local and the big. And so what can we do locally in our school, in the work we do every day?
Well, two quick ones. Some community involvement. You know, start allowing parents and the communities to get involved in the school. Sometimes schools seem like they want to exclude them. And one simple thing in some of our schools are the kids get there sort of early. They're just hanging around for half an hour. Get some volunteers just to work with the kids, build some relationships, and you know, have a little club program in the morning. Simple thing. Another thing, this one is a little structural, but the problem that we have in Lafayette, which we have all across our country, and it's probably across the world, is that we have all these high needs kids concentrated in schools. And so segregation. So we've put all our highest poverty kids, all our highest ACE kids in single schools. We need to figure out how to integrate them into classes where one teacher doesn't have a whole classroom with high needs kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll jump in with a quick one. I think always allow student agency and voice. You know, we know there's more research coming out. Kids know how to articulate, whether it's through behavior or through verbally, what their view is. Let's give processing time and airtime for our young people to tell us what they need in our schools. And our schools and our systems need to remove the small thing teachers can do is remove this idea of controlling the classroom and the individual, because we have no right to control another individual, right? Basic human rights. Give young people a chance to say, I'd like to explore this with my learning. And just the other quick one, I think, is to what John said, is parent engagement. You know, it's not that for some of our schools they don't want to do it, but this is too hard, is some of the stuff that we hear. It's too hard, we don't have the time. I think we're going to cut at a school level, a local level, audit where you spend your time, where we spend our time, and work out what's meaningful, what's giving us impact, and what's not. Let's can it. Let's actually say for 6 months, we won't do these 3 things because we've done it for 4 years and we haven't seen any gains. Why keep doing things that aren't, you know, that doesn't cost anything to audit your own initiatives at your school and work out what's worth doing still. It's just having the right people around the table with some awesome muffins and then getting it done. I'd say those 2 things. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I particularly like the idea of student voice. I think there's a lot to say. And I think, to be clear, that if we solicit student voice, that we listen and we act on what they're saying. Others. Local actions.
I want to say, I agree with John, this intentional, we need to be intentional in our relationships, right? We really connect with those students, connect with those families. And one thing I want to say, for all schools is, work on your hidden curriculum. There are many things that impact our students that we're not aware of. That are part of who we are. Every school has a personality, and we are not aware of those things. And that hidden curriculum could be either empowered, right, or you need to work on it. If it needs to get it, to get away, you need to get rid of it, right? So I think that would be it.
Okay. Thank you. Others.
Should I continue?
Yeah, please.
So I strongly agree on my colleagues' ideas. First, I think it's extremely important to rethink ourselves as a community, we are inserted in a community. We know that we are very responsible to each other. However, over the last 2 years, we've been living very individualistic processes due to the pandemic. So I think we have a huge challenge on rethinking ourselves as a community and rebuild this sense of belonging, where everyone belongs to everyone in a school community. Also, I think it's fundamental to continue providing these spaces, whether face-to-face or online, for reflection and discussion, because from here we can share ideas and thoughts, co-create and gain or update knowledge on trauma and learning. So to finish, I would say, from a very personal experience as a teacher, I would start going from research that I already did to working on a plan to make it visible in my lesson.
Yep. So to take the research and the thoughts and make it, put it into action.
Take action. Yeah.
Put it into action. Yep.
Research translation. Love that. Love that you just said that.
Yeah.
Now, I think to piggyback on that, I'm looking at some of the comments that like Linda and Aaron have made. It's saying they're articulating just that, educating the policymakers and those who are making those funding decisions from the top down, like our school board members, our legislators, about the benefits and the impact of trauma-informed education, so that they can know how to appropriately allocate those resources. I mean, I think that was very well said. But one thing that I feel very passionately about is being able to unite those efforts. I have a very simple story. I came into this work with my mental health knowledge, thinking I know so much and I want to impart this knowledge into those who should know it. And what humbled me to a point of speechlessness and to tears was the day that a little third grade girl who was 8 years old, she had experienced so many hardships from her home and from her family, so many members of her family, that she was expected to do math lessons. And all she could do was throw pencils and flip desks, basically. And so she would spend lots of time in my office as the school counselor. And one day I met a volunteer advocate. We have CASAs, court-appointed child advocates, that came to school because she was taken from custody by her mother. And she brought me this single piece of paper with 3 little points. It was from a program called Trust-Based Relational Intervention, saying children who've experienced hardships need to be able to give them voice, allow them to drink water. So maybe keep a water bottle at their desk, allow them to have a snack, and allow them to voice their needs, give them a voice and be their advocate at school. And it still moves me so deeply. She brought that paper to me and it catapulted me in what I could actually do. And I thought, if it moved me so much, how much more could this move parents? The parents who I'm having to call up as a school counselor to tell them your child is failing. And instead tell them what's going on, not what's wrong with them, but what's going on behind their struggles. Why are they struggling to read? They can't all have learning disabilities. What more is the narrative? And so that story, fast forward a year later, I'd gone deeply into the mental health science of understanding what are adverse childhood experiences, wanted to know that and own it. And started giving those talks in the community. And one day, one of those parents whose child was about to be expelled from our school, she brought back that paper that had been provided to me through my governmental training on childhood adversity and trauma-informed schools. She brought that paper to me, not because I gave it to her, because previously she said, I don't want my child being worked with by a social worker or a counselor. She brought the paper back to me and she said, I now understand that my husband and I, we are a part of my child's cycle of trauma, of adversity. And I've experienced it, my husband's experienced, and we're putting our children through it, through our arguing. She said, I want to tell you about ACEs, and I want to stop this cycle. And can my child come to counseling? It changed that child's trajectory. It changed the family's trajectory, not because of me. I was the system. It was because of the systemic work we were doing in the community, because her neighbor gave her that information. And so reaching our parents from the outside in, I call it an inside out and an outside in model. And so doing that work in the community so our parents can bring this information and advocate for it at the schools is so important.
Thank you, Alyshia. Julie, do you have anything to add? You've been very patient. Thank you.
Actually, Joe, I feel I've said quite a lot. I got a bit carried away in my session.
Okay.
Do you know, I love the story aspect, and I've been speaking to educators across Australia because of the project that the university is doing with Ben's model. And this educator was actually tearing up online in an interview, saying, you know what made the difference for our entire team at the school? We had the original trainer for the Relate model in Australia turn up at the school, and you know, as good teachers, we all turned up with our pads and pens. And that trainer asked us about ourselves, and no one used their pads and pens. And we got to know each other as a team. People I'd worked with, she said, for 10 years, I had no idea. Great things, bad things, all sorts of things. And it was the personalizing to them. So it was that modeling, sitting in training that modeled to them what it was like to be in relationship and to be cared for.
Yeah.
So that holding. So that's my story.
Yeah. Julie, thank you. And
just
thank
make
you.
a connection to.
Go ahead, Ben. Go.
Oh, I was sorry. Yeah, you froze on my screen, but you had a great pose when you did that, and it was your good side, I reckon you would say to me when we look back at the recording. I was going to say, Julie, just to your point, context matters, and that's what I hear when I hear the stories as well of people on this screen. You can have the best content delivery as a ACES educator or a Relate facilitator, and the work that Veronica and Camila you're doing, but if we don't attempt to link it with the context where the people are walking on the soil that they're walking on, and actually deliver it with understanding and compassion and integrity for what we're trying to do together, rather than a bunch of people who understand some of this stuff and want to tell you how life's going to be better, which is not how it is for anyone with lived experience, which at some point, as we've heard today, we all sort of understand this on the screen in our audience. We all do experience some, as ACES says, at the age of 17, will experience a traumatic event. 2 out of 3 will, I understand, is the stat. So yeah, context matters, and coupled with content, we can hopefully change the world a little bit in all our little pockets of work.
Yeah, go ahead, Veronica.
Oh, sorry. I know that we have
please.
lots of. Thank you so much. I know we have lots of teachers, and I'm just going to say something very short. Believe that everything you can do. I know the system has failed you and your students, right? But believe on every little thing you can do. I know this is very cheesy, but one student at a time, and you can make a difference. The impact you can make. Believe that. Work on your own biases so that you take that away of the equation, and you can really work with those students. That's the only thing I wanted to say, Joe.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And first I want to thank everyone for such a wonderful and such a heartfelt conversation, I guess is what I would say. I truly appreciate. I think we all really appreciate it, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for what you brought to this evening's discussion. If I were to try and pull some of the main themes together, it's clear that we all understand this is not a sprint. This is a marathon, right? It is something that's ongoing. I think that we also, all of us are really talking about these systemic factors that hold things in place, and that, the need to over time kind of shift the paradigms in which we work. And one of the important ones is actually taking the time to teach with the whole child, right? Their person, who they are, their experiences and whatnot, and that is part of what real true teaching is, and that context matters, right? The schools we create, the school communities we create, the context within which our students operate are just important. In fact, of more import, if I hear you right, Julie, than sort of the technology of the curriculum. Not that doesn't count, but it is the context that is so important. And then I think the last piece is that not only thinking in terms of the big picture, but the local actions we can take to begin to address this within our school, within our classroom. And I think, as you say, Veronica, one child at a time, those pieces. So I thank you very much. Sal, welcome to the panel. Anything to add here, my friend?
Well, I don't think that I can add anything that really hasn't been said in one way, shape, or form. other than to thank you and all the panelists for your insight, for your experience, and certainly for your passion for the well-being of children. We heard tonight about the importance of changing people's belief system. What everything stems from, everything grows from, what do we believe about children? We believe they have rights. We believe that they ought to be treated in a certain way. Well, we believe that they have vulnerabilities, and therefore we need to act in certain ways. What do we believe about schools and how they need to be structured? What do we believe about teaching practice and how that ought to occur? So I think once again, just that echoing of the importance of a belief system. I was really struck by everybody's comments. I was really struck by the emergence of equity as a substrate, as a theme that just runs throughout all of this. In other words, we need to recognize child rights. We need to recognize there are rights concerns here. There was a question of student voice. The question of, somebody said a child is a person with rights. The question of how do we address those structural issues, structural racism. Ben talked about the funding issues, the policy and the political aspects of things. All of that seems to be, to me, to be part and parcel of the equity question. And then we heard about the growth of this sort of multi-level action plan. In other words, what started out for many people as wanting to do something trauma sensitive for an individual kid became a trauma sensitive class approach, became a trauma sensitive school approach, then the trauma sensitive thinking in terms of a trauma sensitive district, and now, of course, John talked about the importance of community activism. We see the emergence of even the faith-based community as a player in all of this, which really comes back to, as you have all said, local context. What do we have in our local context that we can use to the advantage of children? Once again, I want to thank all of our participants, and certainly people don't recognize the behind the scenes. What Merlin and Patricia Crane Galasay are doing behind the scenes, making all of this happen. So we certainly want to thank them and acknowledge the contributions of Nadej Tosano in setting up the site for us. Patricia, any final comments?
Yes, I just would like to ask everyone on the screen, as well as those in the audience, what should our next steps be? This is our very first international convening, and we want to hear what were the big takeaways and what should our next steps be?
Patricia, that's really easy.
Yeah.
It's muffins in New Zealand.
I don't think Julie's joking. And for our audience there, I don't know about you, but I have a sudden craving after this to go and get muffins. So we've got this muffin joke running, but isn't it nice to have common ground? I wrote for next steps. You need to have another one of these. I mean, these are fantastic opportunities for us to talk about something we all have a connection to and learn from each other. I think we just demonstrated that we're all in different parts of the world, but look at what we're talking about and using technology for good to start this conversation. So another one of these or a series of these and keep expanding. And obviously I can only speak for myself, but I know I'd be very interested to either participate or just to listen, if not a panel, to actually be a participant. And the takeaway, I think for me has actually been in hearing the stories of people on this screen and learning more about what's going on outside of Australia. And it's gotten me very excited to use social media and connect with people on this screen, whether it's through LinkedIn or email, and just stay connected. A takeaway is that we're all understanding some of the common things that Joe and Sal had said in summary. But there's still, the takeaway for me is there's a lot of work to do, but we're not on our own when we need to do it. And that's what I think has been a real takeaway from this group, and hopefully our audience feel the same.
Yeah, I think that also, big takeaway for me is the fact that we are all connected, right? This is not just, it's not just happening in Ecuador, right? It's not just happening here in DC. It's, those, the good and the bad, it's happening all over. It's the same thing, right? It looks a little different, but yeah. And to keep with the muffin joke, I would say, to share the sweetness, right? Keep sharing that sugar, right, with others. So let's keep spreading the word.
Yep.
I don't know if everyone can see the chat. There's lots of applause. There's some wonderful thank yous about the dialogue. I want to have everyone save the date. Yeah, I'll put this one up on the screen. Save the date for our next international convening, October 28th, 2022.
There's also a great suggestion from Linda Knight around specific issues as well, which could be great. So there's some fantastic insight coming from people through this comment section.
Okay, I'm going to share.
Yeah, it's the three before it. It talks about Indigenous knowledge or children's rights or voice. Yeah, some great. I mean, this is about the voice of those listening as well, and it's a great idea. I think.
Yeah.
So a shout out to you, Linda.
So being a pastor makes me think about, like evangelism, and to change the political structures, politicians don't lead, they follow, and you really have to get the community support. So how, one possible question is, how can we all be evangelists? How can we do that? Let the whole community, so there's community support for this. And it emerges not from us, but from the community.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
look at us all ponder that question, John. Look what you've done. Great question.
It was an amazing conversation. I want to thank especially the panelists and everyone who came to join in the dialogue today. Let's do the power of one and act locally, and let's get together again very soon. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Mm-hmm.